that we extend a warm welcome to you all to Winter School 2023 Day 2, jointly organized by the Center for Development Economics and the Econometric Society. We are honored to have with us Professor Jordi Gali, Center for Research in International Economics, CREI, and Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Our esteemed chair for the session is Professor Dibyendu Mehti. Now, I call upon Professor Mehti to present the bouquet to Professor Gali and commence the session.
Let me welcome you all to the second day, first sessions of DSC Winter Schools 2023. I have the privilege to welcome once again Professor Jordi Gali, or Jordi Gali, whatever we pronounce. We have been trying to bring him for last 6-7 years, to be honest, and every time we tried to call him, he said that I'm too busy, and we all understand that his commitment, and so finally we managed to call him, and he is with us. I think those who work in economics, particularly macroeconomics, for them I think we do not need any introduction of him, and I don't want to take much time introducing him. He have been prolific writer on mainstream macroeconomics nowadays, particularly when business cycles is playing important role to destabilize economies. And he is also holding several positions, academic positions, not only in Spain but also in reputed universities in US. And he earned his degree, basic degree from MIT, and then he have been playing instrumental role in EMBIA in terms of an European Economic Association. But let me put him the way I have understood his work. So that would actually help you to contextualize his lectures. Roughly 3 decades ago, we know that the rational schools were trying to argue that we should not do anything. Policy ineffectiveness doctrines are quite established. If individuals are rational, at least policymakers doesn't have any job. So in a way, macroeconomics, especially macroeconomists, lost jobs to some extent. And during that time, a group of scholars who tried to show there has been unsystematic shocks, random shocks, which are continuously hitting the economy and destabilizing the macro variables. So that leading to substantial welfare loss. If really we are seeing the welfare loss, can you see it ideal? If not, then what should be the role? And then he come up with a number of policies, I would say, rule, give some roles to the Reserve Bank as well as to the governments. So when you see this kind of shocks and your economy is stable, at least you can play with this kind of things. When we had no clue, at least he tried to come up with some clues so that at least you can save some welfare loss. And so I would say the literature who has developed this kind of doctrine, he is one of the architects of these literatures. And his book, Macroeconomic Policies, Inflation and Business Cycle, has been quite popular. And following up, there has been various writings, and some of those works has appeared in the leading journals in the field. But at the end, I'd like to also caveat one thing. When I try to teach some part of your book, and some of students are here, they find it a bit hard. And when I also try to offer some optional courses, which is not macro, they always, first day they ask me, would you like to cover any part from Jordi Gali book? Then I said no. So now you are in front of students, so I welcome you to take over this.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for this nice introduction. And thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And well, let's hope. I can only hope that you don't regret it. After after what I just heard, I hope this is not as painful as going through the derivations in my book. So these lectures will deal with a phenomenon that I have always found fascinating. And in fact, it's the fascination with this phenomenon that drove me into economics. Okay? It's the phenomenon of economic fluctuations. Okay? The fact that economies don't grow smoothly, but they are subject to these recurrent ups and downs, expansions, recessions. And I won't claim that this is the most important aspect of economics, not at all. There are things that are far more important than that. But to me, it's something that I have always found mysterious. And I've always thought that trying to understand the nature of and the sources of those fluctuations was a worthy enterprise, because they matter to people. They create uncertainty. They bring down governments occasionally, and policymakers care about them. Sometimes try to do something about them, and people seem to care about, in general, how the economy is doing. Not from a long-term perspective only. Maybe they should put more attention to that long-term perspective, but about these ups and downs. In particular, recessions are periods. Why recessions happen? Okay, that's, to me, that's the most interesting question. In the absence of so, for instance, the recession induced by COVID, to me, is not particularly interesting, okay, because we know exactly what was behind that. But the fact that, in the absence of any destruction of physical capital or human capital, say, of the sort that would be caused by a war or some natural disaster and so on, in the absence of those, why would an economy, why would people in a society end up producing less, working less, at a time when consumption is low, and hence at a time when you would think that it was more important to produce more? So why, to me, this is the question that somehow has always guided me as an economist. And of course, many of the things that I will talk about today, are at least indirectly related to that. But that's certainly the main motivation for my work. Okay. So just to illustrate, obviously, you're all familiar with what business cycles, economic fluctuations are. So this is a picture that illustrates that phenomenon. Not just the employment ratio in the U.S. since for the post-war period, and we see that this ratio, employment. This is the employment to population ratio. How it varies over time. Obviously, this is completely dominated by the COVID recession, which I said it's not, from a macro point of view, it's not particularly interesting. What's happened afterwards is interesting, but I won't talk much about that. But the overall picture, I think, is fascinating. There is some trend that has to do with an increase in the participation, mostly of female participation. Okay, but that's not what this talk will be about. My talk will be about these short-run fluctuations. The shaded areas are recessions. Okay, and we see that these are periods in which the employment ratio comes down significantly. Of course, this is associated with higher unemployment and general malaise in society. No? So the main objective of my lectures will be to give an overview of a particular approach to understanding economic fluctuations, the so-called New Keynesian approach. And this is an approach that has become dominant in macro over the past 2 decades, I would say. And it provides the foundations for many of the models and conceptual tools that are used in central banks and international organizations and governments all over the world. So, you know, I mean, some of you may be familiar, those of you who have taken macro courses obviously will be familiar with that. My goal is to give an overview of that, sometimes getting into some technical details. However, in order to motivate this, so this is what I will do mostly this afternoon, okay? In order to motivate this and the usefulness and the need for this approach, this morning I want to talk about the reasons why we macroeconomists have to move away from a more conventional, orthodox approach to understanding economic fluctuations, which is what I would call the neoclassical approach, which one could associate with the real business cycle theory that was developed in the 80s and the 90s. And what I will argue is that this trying to understand economic fluctuations using a neoclassical frame of mind faces too many challenges. It's hard to, economic fluctuations are hard to reconcile with a neoclassical view of the world. Okay, so that will be the main theme of this morning's lecture. And then in the afternoon, I will provide an overview of an alternative to this neoclassical view. Okay, so this is the outline for the lecture. So lecture 1 is the neoclassical perspective on economic fluctuations. I will illustrate the challenges facing that perspective through a very simple model. And then I will introduce a concept of wedges, okay? As a departure, as a way to think about departing from the neoclassical, what I will call the neoclassical straitjacket. Okay? And then in this afternoon's lecture, I will give an overview of this New Keynesian, this alternative perspective that people usually refer to as a New Keynesian perspective. Okay? And look at some of the implications and insights generated by that perspective. Very good. So let me start with this overview of the neoclassical perspective on fluctuations. And again, feel free if there are I will try to leave some time at the end for questions. But if there are some clarifying questions, please feel free to ask. Okay, to interrupt me and ask. So there are 2 key assumptions behind the neoclassical view. First, the idea of perfect competition, the assumption of perfect competition. Okay? Perfect competition means that economic agents take prices as given, and they think that they can supply as much as they want of the good they produce, or they can demand as much as they want of the good that they consume or use as an input at the existing prices. Okay? So no one is facing a constraint on quantities, or at least they don't perceive themselves as facing a constraint on the quantities they can sell, the quantities they can buy at existing prices. Okay, so this is a key assumption. And the second assumption, also central to this perspective, is the assumption of flexibility of all prices, including wages. Okay? So the notion that we typically associate with to to the Walrasian auctioneer, that somehow prices adjust so that markets clear all the time. Okay? Very good. Now let's look at the model. It will not be a complete description of a model, just some elements of a model that are consistent with that assumption, and the focus will be on the labor market. Okay? So this could be viewed as the core of a real business cycle model. Okay? So assume an infinitely lived representative agent that maximizes this objective function. Okay, so here we have consumption. This is hours of work or employment. We have, here I have introduced, this is the discount factor. ZT is like a shock to the discount factor. Okay, so people become more or less impatient. Okay, and this CT is a shock to the disutility of labor. Okay. Now, an agent subject endowed with those preferences and who participates in a perfectly competitive labor market will want to supply a quantity of labor that will satisfy this optimality condition. Okay, so let me introduce the notation. The notation, I will be using the same notation throughout the lectures. This would be the nominal wage, this is the price, so this is the real wage. Okay. So this household will supply labor up to the point where this object here, what is this? This is the marginal disutility of labor expressed in terms of consumption goods. Okay, so that's what we call the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and labor. So the individual will supply labor up to the point where this marginal rate of substitution equals the real wage. Okay, and again, the individual doesn't perceive that it's facing any constraints in the terms of the quantity of labor that he or she can supply. Okay. Now we can take logs. So from now on, when I use lowercase letters, that refers to the log of the original variable. Okay, so we can take logs of this expression, okay, and we get this. Of course, it's much more convenient to work with these log linear relationships. Okay, very good. Let's look now at firms. Okay, think of a large number of identical firms for simplicity. They all produce an identical good, and so, with this production function, AT is like a common technology parameter that fluctuates exogenously. N is the labor that they hire. Okay, so this firm, when maximizing profits, will choose to hire a quantity of labor that satisfy this condition. So what does this condition say? It says that the firm will hire labor up to the point where the marginal product of labor equals the real wage. Okay? We can take logs of this expression and we get this. So this will be a labor demand schedule. Okay? It tells you how much labor the firm will hire as a function of the real wage or as a function of technology. And notice we can rearrange the terms in this equation and write it like this. So what is this? This is the log of the price. This is the wage. And this term in square brackets is the log of the marginal cost. Now the wage minus the marginal cost in logs has a simple interpretation. It's the margin. Sorry, this is the wage, this is the marginal product of labor. So the wage minus the marginal product of labor in logs has a simple interpretation, it's the marginal cost. So another way of rewriting this expression is to say that the firm will produce up to the point where the marginal cost, which I denote by psi t from now on, equals the price, okay? Which is another way of expressing the optimality condition of a profit maximizing firm, okay? Very good. Now, here comes the magic, We assume, under this perspective, that the wage adjusts so that labor demand equals labor supply at each point in time. Okay, so we can equate the two equations, and we get this, that the marginal rate of substitution, which is on the left-hand side, equals the marginal product of labor. And I think I'm running out of battery here. If you could replace the battery, and I'll keep, because the pointer doesn't seem to. Oh, okay. Now it seems to work. Okay, now it seems to work. Let's see if it keeps working. Okay, so this is a condition that will be satisfied in equilibrium. That's the way we usually represent it. Okay, so here we have labor supply. Okay, which is that the wage is equated to the marginal rate of substitution. Here we have labor demand, an inverse relationship between the wage and employment. So the wage is equated to the marginal product of labor. And the assumption is that the real wage adjusts so that we are always at the intersection of the two. And that determines employment, and it will determine output, and so on. Okay? Notice that I'm not saying anything, I'm not closing the model in the sense I'm not saying anything about whether there are what are the sources of demand? Is there investment, consumption? Is this an open economy, a closed economy? I'm being agnostic about this. I just want to focus on the labor market, labor demand, labor supply. Okay? So this is pretty general. Now, one thing to notice is that this condition, okay, that marginal rate of substitution equates the marginal product of labor, happens to be the optimality condition of the social planner's problem. Okay? So a benevolent social planner that shows directly quantities, but shows them so that this condition is satisfied. Okay? So the economy, under these assumptions of perfect competition and flexibility of wages and prices, attains that first best condition. Okay? So obviously it's just a manifestation of the first welfare theory. Okay? Okay, very good. So now, in this world, how can we generate fluctuations? Okay, so that's the question. Okay? Well, and let's just, for concreteness, let's focus on employment, fluctuations in employment. How could we generate fluctuations in employment of the sort that we observe in actual economies in a world like this? Okay? Well, we take this equilibrium condition and we just rearrange terms. Okay? We move the employment to the left-hand side. Okay? And so we know that this will have to be satisfied at all times. Okay? So it must be the case that employment moves around as a result of either changes in technology, changes in this labor supply shock, okay, the shifter of labor disutility, or changes in consumption. Now, consumption is an endogenous variable, so which may change in response to many different shocks. Okay? So now let's so there are these three possibilities only. Now let's examine them one by one, okay, to see if they have any hope to account for actual fluctuations, the fluctuations that we observe. Okay, so let's think of technology shocks. Okay, so let's turn off, if you want, this labor supply shock, okay, and let's think of technology shocks, that is variations in AT. So these are the kind of shocks that the real business cycle school emphasized and claimed that they could account for the bulk of fluctuations, at least in advanced economies. Okay? Very good. Suppose that this is the main driver of fluctuations. Now suppose, first observation, suppose that consumption did not change in response to technology shocks. Then I will relax this, okay? Then we would observe, clearly, we would expect to observe a positive correlation between this between this technology parameter and employment. Okay? Very good. So let's look at the data. Okay? well, just to see how it would work in terms of the labor market diagram, I will keep going back to this diagram. Okay, so we have technology, a change in technology. So this assumes a reduction in A. Okay, how one is to interpret a reduction in the technology parameter is a different story. Okay, but you can think of what the real business cycle economists would say is, well, technology is improving over time, and you should think of this as a reduction in the rate at which it improves over time, not so much technological regress that we find it hard to conceptualize, but as a negative deviation from a positive trend. Okay, so what this would generate is a shift in labor demand, which we saw depended on technology, to the left, and it would lead to a decline in employment. Okay, so we would expect a positive correlation between the measure of technology and employment. Well, let's look at the data. Okay, so what you see here is a TFP, total factor productivity, measure of technology, as constructed by John Fernald. This is, some of you may be familiar with this. It's the so-called Fernald measure of TFP, which is one that cleans the solo residual from all the problems that the solo residual has as a measure of technology. Namely, this measure takes into account unobserved fluctuations in utilization, monopolistic competition, increasing returns to scale, and so on. Okay, I refer you to the work of John Fernald for that. Okay, so macroeconomists think of this as the best measure of aggregate technology. Okay, if the concept of aggregate technology makes any sense. And what you show, obviously, this shows an upward trend in the data. So what I do here is take the log and then detrend it using a bandpass filter. Okay, just because I'm interested in the fluctuations, not so much in the long-run trend in technology. Okay, so that's in blue, and in red you have the cyclical component, the detrended measure of log employment. So what do we observe? Well, maybe you can see it in just looking at the picture, but this is in fact a negative correlation between these two variables. So measure of aggregate technology and employment at business cycle frequencies are negatively correlated. Okay, that is, periods in which there is a rapid increase in technology are associated with a decline in employment. Okay. Now, the units are percentage points. You can think of, since these are logs multiplied by 100, so you can think of this as deviations in percentage points from a trend. Okay. Very good. Now you can say, well, consumption may not remain constant. Okay, so an increase in technology could be, in this expression, could be offset by a larger increase in consumption. So that would account for the negative correlation between technology and employment. Okay, very good. Well, let's look now not at AT, but let's look at AT minus CT. Okay, we can measure consumption, take the log, and we look at the correlation. So this implies unambiguously that there should be a positive correlation between AT minus CT and NT, employment. Okay, so let's look at that. So this is what I call, in blue now we have what I call consumption adjusted TFP and employment. And the correlation, in fact, becomes more negative. Okay, so clearly, technology shock. The notion that fluctuations can be the result of technology shocks in this neoclassical framework is inconsistent with this property of the data. So let's look for alternatives to technology shocks. Okay, let's consider labor supply shocks. Okay, shocks to this CT. Okay, shocks to the utility of labor. Okay, if that means anything. Okay, people suddenly feel like work. No, they don't find much. There's a reduction in how much this utility the labor generates, or an increase in that this utility. No, people Okay, so let's give that a chance. So what is an implication of the neoclassical framework? Well, if you think of let me go back, of labor demand, okay. Okay, so clearly, now we're turning off technology, okay, so A is constant. So there should be a negative, unambiguously, there should be a negative correlation between the real wage and employment, okay? So let's look at the data. Okay, and why? Okay, again, let's take a look at the labor market. Well, suppose that there is an increase in this CT shock. Okay, so that's an increase in the marginal disutility of labor. That would shift the labor supply to the left. It doesn't affect labor demand. Okay, so the real wage would go up, employment would go down. Okay, so a negative correlation between the real wage and employment. Let's look at the data.
Jordi?
Yes.
How should we think of credit market, financial market shocks in this framework?
Yeah, no, I have not introduced financial markets at all. Obviously, in the background, if there are financial markets, they typically in these neoclassical models, they work efficiently, okay? But so it doesn't. They certainly don't affect labor supply. The only thing that the worker cares about when the labor supply decision is an intratemporal decision. Okay, so the only thing that the worker should care about is the wage, okay, and the marginal disutility of labor, so the marginal utility of consumption. Okay, so there are no intertemporal considerations here.
But how about the demand side?
No, the demand side again is same thing. Okay, it's the only thing the only thing that cares about. The firm believes that it has no financial constraints. It can produce as much as it wants, given the wage of workers that it hires, and the price of the good which it takes as given. Okay, so there are no financial considerations. Don't enter the picture at all. Okay, again, I'm not saying that in the real world they are not important. In the standard. Under the standard neoclassical view, those considerations are not important for this aspect of the model, for the labor demand and labor supply. Okay. So going back to this, if we have labor supply shocks, the model would predict unambiguously that there should be a negative correlation between the real wage and employment. Okay. So what do we observe in the data? Well, essentially a zero correlation, is slightly positive. Okay, so we have here the trended real wage, the trended log real wage, the trended employment, and there's no obvious correlation between the two. Okay, this is actually an observation that traces back to Keynes's general theory, or the critique of Keynes's general theory, okay, because under the assumptions that Keynes made in his general theory, the clear implication was that wages should be counter-cyclical, real wages should be counter-cyclical. We don't, and people like Dunlop and Tarshish and others looked at the data and said, look, there's no evidence whatsoever of counter-cyclicality of wages. No. Very good. So another way, to me, the prima facie way of discarding labor supply shocks as a source of fluctuations, a significant source of fluctuations, is just to look at the data on labor force participation and employment. So here you have the two compared. So in blue, labor force participation, in red, employment, and you see obviously the two share a trend. That's what we would expect, but we don't care about that. We care about the short-run fluctuations for the purposes of these lectures. And we see that the participation hardly shows any fluctuations at business cycle frequencies. If labor supply shocks were the driver of macro fluctuations, we would expect this series to display large fluctuations at business cycle frequencies. It doesn't. Okay. Of course, many of you must think, well, we didn't need all these kind of arguments to rule out labor supply shocks as the source of fluctuations. It comes from just common sense, no? But here I'm trying to give the neoclassical view a chance. Okay? Very good. So we have discarded technology shocks. We have discarded labor supply shocks. Well, but there may be many other shocks, fiscal shocks, all kinds of shocks.
Jordi?
Yes.
One simple interpretation of that level supply shock could be Keynesian activities, trading activities, strength of trading.
Yeah, but I don't want to introduce that in the neoclassical framework. Okay, I want to stay away from that. Okay, but we'll see. That will enter, in this afternoon's lecture. Okay, here I wanted to interpret it because that would be a source of inefficiency, and here I want to stick to a framework in which all fluctuations are efficient and so on. Okay.
Jordi, follow-up question on that. Why is labor force participation not an equilibrium outcome? I mean, why do you think that measures the diffusibility of income rather than the labor market equilibrium? Because when you want less labor, then you hire less labor. So participation, you're measuring it as if you're measuring the desire to work rather than the people who are actually working,
yeah.
It's okay. And so maybe you can say a little bit about that.
So, I mean, yeah, that's a good point. There's a bit of a... So if I show you this picture, the one we were just seeing. I mean, just looking, the fact that there is a gap between the two already points, that's something I was living for it was my fourth point, to a counterfactual implication of the model, because the model, the way we have set it up, everyone who wants to work, works, and as much as they want, because there are no constraints. The fact that there is a gap between the two is already a contradiction of the model. The gap, obviously, the gap is what we call unemployment. Okay. So in the model, there shouldn't be any such gap. Okay. But it's actually I think it's the fourth point. But before I get to that, let's consider other shocks that maybe are not modeled explicitly, because it is, again, as I said, this is not a closed model. I'm not completing a model. I'm just looking at one aspect of model, which is the labor market. But so how would other shocks, okay, end up affecting employment? Well, if we turn off technology shocks, if we turn off labor supply shocks, the only way that other shocks under this perspective would end up affecting employment is through its impact on consumption. And why is that? Why? That seems a bit strange. Why? Well, because changes in consumption affect the marginal utility of consumption in this framework, and hence the willingness to supply labor. Okay? Very good. So let's give that a chance. Okay? So, but in this case, it is clear that those shocks, okay, potential drivers of economic fluctuations, those shocks will generate a negative co-movement between employment and consumption. Okay, why? Because when consumption is high, marginal utility of labor, marginal utility of consumption would be low, and the incentive to work would be low. So employment would be reduced. Okay? Now, I don't need to show you maybe the picture, but we know that this is not true. Okay? Okay, so this is the way it would work. It would work through changes in labor supply and shifts in the labor supply schedule. Okay, so if we look at the data, the trended employment and the trended consumption show a very clear positive correlation. Okay, booms are periods in which both employment and consumption increase. Recessions are periods in which both employment and consumption decrease. And this is in contradiction with the implications of this neoclassical framework. Okay? And the final remark is related to Rohini's point. And there is no, the model by assumption implies there is no involuntary unemployment, because we are always on the labor supply, by assumption, okay? Because real wages always adjust so that we are always on the labor supply. So there is no involuntary unemployment, so the unemployment rate, if you want, would be zero. And obviously, if the unemployment rate is zero, then there wouldn't be any correlation between the unemployment rate and employment. Okay, so we're always on the labor supply, but if we look at the data, we know that there's a strong correlation, negative correlation between employment and the unemployment rate. Please.
I mean, this is a bit of a naive view of technology, in the sense that one could easily think of this period of technology affecting consumption, in the sense that the marginal utility of consumption goes up as technology brings new consumer goods on the market, which is very much true during this period.
So one way to, I agree, one way to model that would be by introducing a shock on the utility of consumption. It would have exactly, from the point of view of the implications, it would have exactly the same effect as the labor supply shock. Because what the labor supply shock, the way I introduced it, the CT that was pre-multiplying the disutility of labor, what it does is it changes the relative disutilities of labor versus consumption. So what you're suggesting would be effectively the same.
So
it would shift the labor supply.
So what you're saying basically is that when, say, color television appear on the market, people are going to increase labor supply so
yes.
they can buy a color television and a laptop and things like
Other
that.
things equal, that would be the case. Okay. Please.
So can we say, so the technology shock, it enters, so it affects the whole objective function. So my technology shock can induce a labor supply shock. So
The technology shock can induce a shift in the labor supply because, through the equilibrium, which if we were to close the model, it may end up affecting consumption.
So together, can they explain some amount of economic fluctuation?
No, because I have argued that if this was the case, that was a possibility, okay? But you would not be. This would be an implication, okay? When you adjust technology by consumption, okay, just look at this. Okay, when you adjust technology by consumption, this consumption-adjusted technology should be positively correlated with employment. But that's not true. That's not true in the data. Okay, so we have to rule that out. Yes.
There's many other simplifying assumptions here other than perfect competition. In particular, technological. This is homogeneous labor, right? So technological.
Yes.
That can, even in a perfect market, that can explain overall aggregate employment fluctuations because maybe the differences in skill and unskilled unemployment. So I can extend the neoclassical model to incorporate heterogeneous labor, and maybe some of these pictures might change.
It could, but then one would have to argue, that these elements are essential to economic fluctuations. Of course, here I cannot look at all possible. I'm using as I said, the simplest possible model, okay? But which is, as I said, it's the core of the standard real business cycle model, which many economists at some point argued was all we needed in order to explain economic fluctuations. Okay, here I'm trying to make the case that this is not true. Okay, very good.
Jordi, a philosophical point,
Okay.
a naive point, is that we assume that consumers look at lifetime utility, but firms look at period by period marginal product. Is that very standard, and is there a discussion around that?
Yeah, it's not important here. Again, it may be important for other aspects of the model. Because the labor supply decision, which is what I have focused on here, is an intratemporal decision. So you could have had, overlapping generations, whatever, and you would have gotten exactly the same labor supply. It's purely intratemporal, okay? So that's not crucial. Okay, so very good. So again, we see that a number of counterfactual predictions. So very good. So in a sense, we conclude, or I would like to argue that this is sufficient to say, look, we have to depart one way or another from this framework, no? That what I call the neoclassical straitjacket. Okay. So let me suggest a very general, I would argue, completely general way of departing from this neoclassical framework, again, and then we'll try to give content to this. So this is so I want to introduce the notion of wedges, okay? And in particular, I will want to introduce two different wedges. The first one is a wedge between the real wage and the marginal rate of substitution. And let me call this, let me denote it by mu W, and let me refer to it, I could call it whichever way I want, let me call it wage markup, okay? Well, because in a sense it's like it measures how much the real wage is above the marginal rate of substitution. Now in the neoclassical framework that we have just seen, under perfect competition and so on, the wage markup would be zero, okay? Because the real wage should be equal to the marginal rate of substitution at all points in time. Now we're going to let it be different from zero. Now, typically we want to impose that it's not negative. Why? Well, because if it was negative, that would mean that people are working more than they want to work. So if we rule out slavery, then I think that you cannot force people to work more than they want to.
Then I disagree with you.
Okay.
Strongly, because most jobs basically are you either work n hours a day or you don't work at all. And you can't come to your employer and say, I want to work, 0.73 for a full-time job.
That's a good point.
That's been a feature of capitalism since the Industrial Revolution.
That's true. I guess you have to take maybe a longer-term perspective and say, look, on average, I mean, well, obviously there's part-time employment too, and so on. But here, maybe you want to interpret this. Again, my focus was on fluctuations in employment, not so much in fluctuations in hours. So think of the extensive margin. People, you either choose to work or not to work. No one can force you to work. Okay? If the conditions are not, you don't find them appropriate, you stay at home.
But the choices are discrete.
I agree, and this is an interesting point. It's an indivisibility, okay, that creates a complication, okay. And I want to abstract from that. Okay, so but let's think about it from the point. Let's interpret again. We have a representative agent here. Let's think of this representative agent to being a large family, with many members, and they have to be the head of the household decides how many of the members will go to work. Okay, and no one is what is true is that no one is forced to work. Okay. So that's the assumption here. Again, it will be a useful assumption. It's not critical. Huh? Okay, and now let's look at the other wedge. Okay, so again, in the neoclassical framework, we had that the real wage was always equal to the marginal product of labor. Okay, now let's allow for a gap between the two. Okay. And let me interpret this. Notice that we can rearrange terms here and write it like this. And what is this? This is the price minus the object in brackets can be interpreted as the marginal cost. The nominal wage minus the marginal product of labor in logs can be interpreted as the marginal cost in this framework. So a natural label for this wedge is a price markup. Okay. And again, firms cannot be forced. Maybe this it's easier to swallow. Firms cannot be forced to produce and sell at a price below their marginal cost. They can always choose to stop operations, to stop producing or reducing production. Okay, so that's why a natural assumption is that this should be non-negative. Okay. Very good. So again, these are just definitions. Okay, we introduce these concepts. Now, a result that is useful is, well, you can add the two conditions. Okay, you can add the two conditions, and well, this is a concept that we introduced in a paper with Mark Gertler and Lopez Salido. We call it the efficiency gap. So it's the gap between the marginal rate of substitution and the marginal product of labor. Okay, remember these two objects should be equal in the efficient allocation. So if there is a gap between the two, there is some inefficiency, and if you add up the two conditions or the two definitions, okay, you can see that this gap is just equal to minus the sum of the two markups. Please.
Is a kind of market imperfection that you're bringing in the model?
What's that?
Is a kind of market imperfection that you're bringing in the model?
Well, at this point, I'm not saying anything what's behind this. Later, I will give some economic content to that. There may be many reasons. It could be, market power. The goods market, in the labor market, would be a natural source of this, but it could also be, distortionary taxation, other things. Obviously, you need some kind of imperfection, okay? But at this point, I'm not saying what can be behind that, okay? So this, let's call this the gap, okay? Which is the sum of the two markups, and obviously with a minus sign, so this should be negative, okay? So the more negative this is, the more inefficient the economy is, in a sense. Okay, so how do we represent this in this simple labor market diagram that I've been using throughout? Well, very simple. It means that once we get rid of this straitjacket, it means that we're allowing the economy to be anywhere in this area here. Okay, so we have to be at a point where the wage, if we take seriously those inequalities that I imposed, that the wage is less than the marginal product of labor, because otherwise firms wouldn't want to produce and sell, and it has to be above, or certainly not below, the marginal rate of substitution, which is given by the labor supply. So we are restricted to this. But if these wedges are flexible, if they can take any value, okay, that means that we can be anywhere around here. Okay, so that frees us from that important constraint that was given by the assumption, which was an assumption, that the wage would always adjust so that we are at this point. Please.
The equilibrium employment
we get in here, equilibrium employment.
Equilibrium. I think it's best if you don't use the mic.
Equilibrium employment we get on the intersection of labor supply and labor demand.
Yes.
And we are getting N naught here, employment.
Yes, so
the gap is the involuntary unemployment.
Yeah, I'll say something about this in a second. Okay, there will be this gap. Okay, we will see. But at this point, we're saying, okay, if we allow for these wedges, we can be anywhere in this area. And this is now let me relate this to the concepts of the price markup and the wage markup. So the price markup is given by this distance. Okay, the distance between the marginal product of labor and the real wage, and the wage markup is the distance between the real wage and the marginal rate of substitution. And the sum of the two is what I call the gap. Okay, so it's a measure of the inefficiency. Okay, so I will always go back to this picture to relate the new concepts that I introduced to this labor market diagram. Okay, so now let me put forward the following hypothesis. The kind of fluctuations, macro fluctuations that we observe are essentially fluctuations in this gap. Okay, that's a hypothesis. Okay, again, the neoclassical view, under the neoclassical view, this gap is always zero. Okay, take the extreme position, say that real business cycle economists took. This gap is always zero, so the fluctuations that we observe have nothing to do with fluctuations in efficiency because we're always at the efficient allocation, given technology, given preferences, and so on. Okay? So now let me put this forward. this hypothesis as forward, and let's try to evaluate it. Now, in order to evaluate this hypothesis, we need to measure this gap somehow, okay? And see if it's correlated with observed fluctuations. So let's see how we can do that. We need to make some assumptions. Nothing comes for free, okay? So first let's measure how to measure the price markup and how to measure the wage markup. So the price markup, let's think of a technology. It's not general, but it's supposed that the technology is given by this production function where X can be any inputs, capital, intermediate inputs, okay? Doesn't matter. The only restrictive assumption is that output is isoelastic with respect to labor. If that's the case, the marginal product of labor in logs can be written is proportional to average labor productivity. That's a simple derivation, okay? And hence, we can define the price markup. Well, the price markup is defined this way. I introduced it earlier. And now replace this expression for the marginal product of labor into here, rearrange terms, and what we get is this. What is this? This is total labor income. This is total nominal income. So the difference between the two in logs, it's the labor income share. Okay, let me denote the labor income share by little st. And now I'm struggling again with the battery. So maybe, I don't know if you have if you can fix this. Okay, so the labor income share, the log of the labor income share is what I call ST. That's something that we observe, okay? So maybe the constant term, the log of 1 minus alpha, will not be identified, but it doesn't matter because we don't care about the level, we care about the fluctuations, okay? For our purposes here. So we can measure those fluctuations in the price markup just using the labor income share. So we'll see that, okay? Let's see if this works, okay? Very good. Now let's look at the wage markup. The wage markup, remember, was the gap between the real wage and the marginal rate of substitution. Under the assumption on utility that I made, the marginal rate of substitution takes this form. Let's see who wins. Very good. Okay, so we can we have that expression for the wage markup. Okay, but obviously we don't observe that labor supply shock. Thank you. So let's see how we can deal with this. Now let's define participation. So let's, as opposed to employment, okay, so now we're going to allow for a gap between employment and participation, okay, if you want, between employment and labor supply. And let's assume that the labor supply, or participation, is determined by the perfectly competitive labor supply, okay, so and let's denote it by L, okay. Now this is labor supply as opposed to employment, which is N, okay. So this determines, this equation that we had seen earlier, determines how much labor the representative agent wants to supply given the wage and given consumption. Very good. Now just do combine this definition with this other, if you want, equation that defines the labor supply, and you get this simple relationship that says that the wage markup is proportional to the gap between the log labor supply and log employment. And this gap has a simple interpretation, what we could call the unemployment rate, okay? UT. Okay, so if we are willing to make some assumption on this coefficient phi that measures the curvature of the labor disutility, then on the unemployment rate we observe, okay, so we can infer what is the wage markup, okay, on the basis of the unemployment rate. So this is something that I proposed, this approach I proposed in a paper on 2011, the return of the wage Phillips curve, okay, and I'm going to use it here, okay, to come up with a measure of the wage markup. Now, from the point of view of the diagram, again, not surprisingly, so if we're at this point, the economy is at this point, okay, the unemployment rate can be represented by this distance, the distance between actual employment and the labor supply given labor market conditions. Okay, so that's how we would represent the unemployment rate, and you can see that given the linearity, okay, this unemployment rate, this distance, will be proportional to this distance, okay, with the coefficient of proportionality being given by the slope of this line, and the slope of this line is given by psi. Okay, so that it's the graphical counterpart to this. Got lost here. To this relationship here. Okay, very good. Now one can put things together. Okay, here we have the efficiency gap, which is the sum of the minus the sum of the two markups, and I've shown you how to, under some assumptions, okay, that should be clear, to measure those markups, okay, using data on the labor income share and the unemployment rate. We need to make some assumption on this phi. Nothing that I will show you next depends on the value of this phi, obviously for reasonable values of this phi. This is related to the labor supply elasticity and so on. So a number that people use in calibrations of this model is 1, okay? So that's what I'm going to assume in the pictures that I will show you next, okay? So let's look at now I will show you measures of the gap and measures of the two components of the gap, what I will call the goods market component and the labor market component, or if you want, the price component and the wage component of the gap, okay? So here we go. Again, this is for the post-war US. The gap is the red line, the price component is the green line, the labor component, or the wage markup component, is the blue line, okay? The fact that, again, the level is not identified, okay? I just normalize it to be equal to 0 in the first period, okay? So the lower is the value taken by these measures. That means the larger is the inefficiency, the larger is the gap relative to the first best, okay? So what do we make out of this picture? The first thing that, jumps at you is that there is a downward trend, okay? So in the gap itself, okay? So in the overall gap. So that suggests that the economy has become more inefficient over time. What's behind that downward trend? Largely, it's the green line that accounts for that. So it has to do with the price markups. Especially in the more recent period, starting around 2000, we see that this inefficiency increases a lot. And that's associated with something that many economists have observed in recent years, namely that market power in the goods market, as captured by price markups, okay, has increased a lot. And that increases the inefficiency of the overall economy. Now, this is a trend that kind of shapes this downward trend. But if you look, that's not what I'm interested in here. Okay, that's important. It's probably more important than what I'm interested in. Okay, but that's not the focus of these talks. The focus of these talks are the business cycle fluctuations. Okay, if we look at the business cycle fluctuations, they are mostly related to the wage component. Okay. So to the changes in the degree of inefficiency in the labor market, okay, that are clearly, we see that it goes down in recessions, it goes up in booms, and so on. Remember that the gray areas are the recessions, okay. So and that accounts for the cyclical behavior of the gap. Okay, the overall gap. So here, what I'm doing is I'm detrending, since I said, let me focus on the fluctuations, I'm detrending the overall gap. So that's the blue line, okay? And I'm also showing it against the trended employment. And clearly there is a very strong positive correlation. So that hypothesis that I put forward is clearly satisfied in the data. Okay, fluctuations in employment, okay, or in overall economic activity, are associated with fluctuations in the degree of inefficiency in the economy. So that So in particular, recessions are periods in which the degree of inefficiency, aggregate inefficiency, is particularly large. And mostly as a result of inefficiencies in the labor market. Please, Nosumi.
Can you just go back to your previous slide where you defined the wage gap? The previous one? No, yeah. So I'm a bit confused because you are trying to measure the gap in new. One is coming from the price market, the other one is from the labor market.
Yeah.
And you're trying to relate that to unemployment itself. But
Yes.
here the measure and your definition was sort of, it's kind of coming from there itself. So I don't know what, if you're trying to relate unemployment rate to the inefficiency, they are by definition related. So,
not by definition, it's a result of combining these two, it's a result of combining a number of things. First, the definition of the wage gap, my assumption on the utility function, which is relatively standard, but it's an assumption, okay? And my assumption on what determines labor supply, which say, look, it's determined by what would be the labor supply under perfect competition. So how much, this equation says, well, how much individuals want to work, okay, given labor market conditions, in particular given the wage and given consumption. So if you combine these two, okay, you get this simple relationship that the wage markup will be reflected, in a sense, in the observed unemployment rate. So that's what allows me to use the unemployment rate to measure the wage markup. Again, I have to make some assumption on phi.
But that assumes that there's nothing else that's affecting the observed unemployment rate, like frictional research costs.
That's right. Okay, so again, there are assumptions. I said nothing comes for free. There are assumptions. Okay. So you could think of these frictions, these labor market frictions. Obviously, the unemployment rate, why would it be zero? No, because there are frictions, there are shocks. Even in an efficient economy, there may always be some frictional unemployment, but that may be more or less constant. May not be associated with the fluctuations that we observe at business cycle frequencies. Okay, but I agree. I mean, the framework here assumes away these surge frictions or frictions of that sort. Okay. As I said, I'm using the simplest possible framework. So we see that that fluctuations can be interpreted as fluctuations in the degree of aggregate efficiency of the economy. And where does this come from? Does it come from the price markup? Well, a little bit. There's a positive correlation, okay, but not very strong. Okay, it's mostly the wage markup. And you shouldn't be surprised because we know that the unemployment rate is highly procyclical. If we measure the wage markup using the unemployment rate, so clearly we're bound to obtain this very strong correlation. Okay, very good. So now we can modify the previous equations, the labor supply and the labor demand, by introducing these wedges. Okay, so here again, I haven't said anything about where those wedges come from. What are the distortions behind those wedges? It doesn't matter at this point. Okay, so here it's by definition. Okay, so this is the wage gap, the wage markup, that's the gap between the real wage and the marginal rate of substitution. And here we have the price markup, which is the wedge between the real wage and the marginal product of labor. Okay? Now, combine the two equations to eliminate the real wage, and I can write down an equation for employment as I did earlier. Okay? And now we have this additional term. Okay, so now we have more free, now we, under certain assumptions on how the wedges respond to shocks, we will be able to reconcile the model with the observations. And in particular, suppose that, could fluctuations be driven by technology shocks? Okay, well, we know that this correlation is negative in the data. Okay. So how could we get a negative correlation? Well, we'll get a negative correlation if markups are sufficiently procyclical. So if in response either the wage markup or the price markup. Okay, now here I'm not taking a stand on that. If in response to an increase in technology, markups increase sufficiently, okay, so that employment goes down. Okay, so that's one way to reconcile the model. Of course, at this point we have complete freedom. Okay, but just trying to determine how those markups should respond to shocks in order to reconcile the model with the empirical evidence. Now forget about technology shocks, let's turn them off. So how about other shocks? So for in particular, well, any other shock. So if we don't have, okay, so here, okay, so let's look at this equation. Okay, in the absence of changes in the price markup, we know that the real wage should be negatively correlated to employment if there are no technology shocks. Okay, but in the data we observe that this correlation is around 0. Okay, so how can we get that? Well, if price markups are countercyclical, so in a boom, employment goes up, but if the price markup at the same time goes down, then the real wage will not change much, and we will get this acyclical real wage as we observe in the data. Also, if you look at this equation, suppose that, turn off both shocks, the technology shock and the labor supply shock, and consider any other shock that would work through consumption, changes in consumption. Okay. Now, in the absence of variations in the markups, we saw that would imply a negative correlation between employment and consumption, but we observe a positive correlation, a very strong positive correlation in the data. What do we need in order to get that? Well, countercyclical markups. If markups are sufficiently countercyclical, that is, if they go down sufficiently when consumption increases, then employment and consumption may move in the same direction. Okay? Now, in response to any shock whatsoever, now in the data, we observe the unemployment rate is negatively correlated with employment, obviously. What do we need in order to get that? We need wage markups, and we need that the wage markup is countercyclical. Okay, that is when the economy is expanding, the wage markup should go down, because we want the unemployment rate to go down, and we saw that the wage markup and the unemployment rate are positively related under this framework. Okay, so what is it that we want? Okay, in order to reconcile, I mean, this is a very general framework. Okay, I introduced these wedges; those are just definitions. I didn't say where they come from and so on. So it's completely general. Okay, anything that generates a gap between the real wage and the marginal product of labor, or the real wage and the marginal rate of substitution. Okay, so the only thing, this is a list of properties that those wedges, okay, that I call markups, have to satisfy in order to reconcile the framework with the empirical evidence on fluctuations. Okay, so what do we need? What are we missing now? And in a sense, this will be, well, what we need is a complete model that explains how those markups are determined. Okay, and obviously here it's an open field, no, and anyone can propose a model of those wedges, and one can interpret most of economics, most of interesting economics as modeling those imperfections that generate those wedges, no? And thinking about what policy can do about those wedges and so on, no? So what I will show you this afternoon is a particular model, okay, that explains those wedges, how those wedges are determined, how they move in response to shocks, and so on. And I will argue that under reasonable assumptions, all those properties are satisfied in that model. Okay, and that model, or that general framework, if you want, is what I call the new Keynesian framework, in which the main source of those wedges is first the existence of market power, in principle both in the goods market and the labor market, but that's not enough, as we will see. We need something else, and that something else in the new Keynesian framework is the presence of nominal rigidities. Sticky prices, sticky wages. Okay? And that will, in combination with shocks, generate fluctuations in these markups that, in most cases, are consistent with the empirical evidence. Okay? So in that sense, I will argue that the new Keynesian framework provides a much more useful way of thinking about economic fluctuations than a neoclassical framework. Okay? So that will be the subject of this afternoon's lecture, and I'll stop here. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. I'll be happy to listen to your questions or comments. Please.
Yeah, so Jordi, I mean, this is a beautiful presentation, but I would argue that if there was something you would complain about the neoclassical model, in addition to what you said, is that it is essentially, if you want it as a theory of economic fluctuation, that it's a little bit like playing Hamlet without the prince, you know, because that literature never had any way of dealing with financial markets and with the inherent instability of financial markets. And historically speaking, you know, as a huge literature has shown all the way, you know, from Rogoff and Reinhardt down, is essentially that it is almost impossible to understand economic fluctuations without worrying about what's happening in the financial sector.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in a sense that only strengthens the point I have tried to make, because I have argued here that even without bringing those financial market imperfections into consideration, the framework fails to account for fluctuations. So even if financial markets were perfect, okay? Even if financial markets were perfect. Now, I would say, how would people, people in the real business cycle literature probably respond to your question? They would say, look, it's true, many recessions have been associated with financial crisis. Our framework, in fact, there are no financial transactions in this framework because everyone is the same. So they're in equilibrium. No one is lending to anyone, no? But they would say, look, many fluctuations, many recessions are not associated with financial crisis. Okay? There are some recessions, important ones, that we interpret as being associated with financial crisis, but not the regular recession. So they would argue, maybe it's not important, of course, that when the financial crisis came, that led to some thinking, on the part of real business cycle economists about that something was missing in the framework because they could not account for that, no? But it goes beyond that, and that's the point. Even the most basic, simple relationships that involve the labor market, which is what I have stressed here, implied by the neoclassical framework, are inconsistent with the evidence on all fluctuations, not only those associated with financial crisis. But I agree that it's another dimension. Now, this is something, in the new Keynesian framework that I will present this afternoon, no financial frictions are not introduced in the simple, because I'm going to use the simplest possible framework. Now, many people, including myself now, are working on extensions of the framework that incorporate those financial frictions. And, but I won't have much to say about those today. Okay. Rohini.
You now have a lot of micro high-frequency data, right? And so...
so can you use mic because others need to also hear?
There will be a 3 to 5 meters. There will be a problem.
So when we actually look at the data on these markups, because now we actually have studies of actual productivity, how many meters of cloth people are doing, how much steel they're doing, that kind of thing. And so there is a way to actually measure these markups. Do you want to say a little bit about this? Because it seems to me, even though your model is very simple because it's a one-sector model, it might be that they're crucial sectors where markups are high and then that reverberates through the economy when there's some kind of a shock, you know? So do we have much data on actually measuring markups and seeing which ones are critical to inefficiency?
People, like my colleague Yannick Hout and co-authors have used microdata to measure markups at the level of individual firms, and then they typically aggregate those and construct measures of average markups that are more sophisticated than the simple one that I have used here, and so on. What I'm not aware of is people using those the measures of individual firms' markups to explore the cyclical properties of those. But in a sense, I mean, it would be interesting. It would be interesting to do. I'm not familiar with any work that does it, but those fluctuations, I think that they would be, I won't say distorted because that's not the right word, but it would be dominated by idiosyncratic shocks that may happen at the level of each firm. That somehow, when we, if one is interested in aggregate fluctuations, you may want to abstract from, no? But that's something that could be done. I mean, people are because some of these sophisticated measures of aggregate markups that people are developing now, mostly to emphasize the trends, no? The fact that markups have been increasing, and they try to explain that, what's behind that, and so on. Those are aggregate, but again, it would be interesting to look at the behavior also at the micro level. Also, for simple technologies, we're talking about meters of clothing or something. That's something where we could get a very precise measure of the markup. That would be very interesting, no? And to see how they are connected to aggregate fluctuations. If there's some connection to aggregate fluctuations.
Thank you. This has been a very fascinating, interesting talk. But what kind of puzzles me is that how much of the deviation we see in your presentation between what would we expect from the model and what reality is. It seems to me that at least part of it can be attributed to the simplicity of the model. In the sense that, if credit constraints or financial market cycles stops you from hiring, right, and thereby questioning the basic assumption. Yeah. Similarly, if there are technological advances that introduce market friction in the sense that, you need new skills to get the job or search for a job, some of the deviations will come from there itself, and therefore are attributable to the simplicity of the model. Well, and therefore, are you exaggerating the deviation differences, for?
I mean, but what I would argue, I mean, it's all, you can take different positions as to what the benchmark should be, no? And, I have adopted as a benchmark, obviously it's a very simple model, one could look at variations on these, relax some of the assumptions on the utility function, for instance, but all the things that you mentioned, to me, are examples of potential sources of those wedges. Okay, so one, and I think it's perfectly legitimate, one can come up with a model in which, credit constraints may affect how much labor, as you said, firms can hire. Okay, so maybe the presence of these credit constraints will imply that the firm cannot be at its its neoclassical profit maximizing point. So that would be reflected here as a wedge.
But
okay?
Some of these can be addressed within the framework of neoclassical framework. That's the point I want to make.
That's a matter of definitions of semantics, no? In my view, I mean, if I take a narrow view of what the neoclassical framework is, credit constraints should not be there, because if you extend the notions of perfect competition and flexibility of prices to financial markets, you'd say that at any point in time, firms should be able to borrow as much as they want at the market interest rate. Okay, so no firm should be constrained by the lack of access to financial markets, something like that. Obviously, things that are important in the real world. Okay, but that those could be potential sources of wages. These are not the ones that I will emphasize this afternoon. They are not the ones that are central to the new Keynesian framework. As I said, nominal rigidities are central to the new Keynesian framework, but I'm not saying that they are not important. I think they are very important.
Thank you for the talk. You did mention that a lot of these price markups could come from market power. Now, I'm wondering, what about the effect on technology? The technology shocks you talk about. Joel Mukherjee here himself has a paper on the resistance to innovation from market power. I'm wondering, does your discussion today in the afternoon have a relation with market power and the endogeneity of technology itself, the technology shocks?
Yeah, well, technology. I see. No, that's an interesting observation. Obviously, this is very important. We always in economics we always have to stop somewhere, no? And when we determine what's exogenous, what's endogenous, it is clear that technology is not completely exogenous. Professor Mockir has a wonderful book that you should all read, The Lever of Riches, no? In which, it's interesting how he doesn't connect major advances in technology to business cycles, because we don't have any evidence on business cycles that goes far in the past. But it is clear that there is some component of technology, of innovation, that may have to do with business cycles themselves, and we have evidence on that. In particular, there is simple evidence. R&D, expenditures on R&D are procyclical. They go down in recessions. That's one thing that firms can save on easily in a recession, especially if they are constrained financially and so on. And that has an impact on measures of technology. But, as macroeconomists, we have to stop at some point. And so here we're thinking of aggregate technology as being exogenous. But I agree completely with you that, and in fact, you pointed to something that may be very important, no? That it has to do with the interaction between market power and innovation itself, no? And that's something that I encourage you to pursue maybe in your research, because you can be sure that you will be at the frontier of research if you make that connection. Certainly not something that I will deal with today. Yeah.
Last question.
I think the question is already been asked. It's about it's a general question about technology.
There are ways of introducing this technology that it's capital augmenting, and think about it. At any point in time, in the short run, the capital stock is like the Titanic. It's not something that you can move much in the short run. Okay, so here I abstracted from capital. Okay, you could extend everything that I said to a framework in which is capital stock, endogenous investment, and so on. But in the short run, the capital stock is more or less predetermined. Okay, and again, there are ways of introducing this technology shocks. The mechanisms work slightly in different ways, and so on. But from the point of view of these technology shocks that you were referring to could be interpreted through the lens of the framework that I used today as being one of the other shocks that I mentioned. Okay?
Fascinating talk. So let me respond to one thing the Ram and the other guy has asked. Since I know the methodology, the way the TAP has been calculated, where the contribution of the technology has been deducted from the residue, which is supposed to be capturing the pure random shocks. So that's why the technology which is supposed to be also affected by the financial variables, also the markup has been taken care of. So that endogeneity issues has been, so the residue that we consider is, let's wind up, then we can continue our discussions in the lawn. So we'll meet up half an hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Guys, please moving for the
process won't be first identify the person, right? So I think it's moving to person. So पहले अगर हम नहीं जाने
बीच में
Thank you.
Learn about the effect of this.